One of the key narratives of the 20th century is the independence movement of the former Western imperial colonies after the Second World War. So we're going to take a look at the process of decolonization, of taking these Western colonies and the formation of hundreds of independent states. But this process was not easy. And if you're looking at some of the dates that you see on this map here, you're going to find that independence does not happen in 1945 or 1950, many of which is the 1960s, almost 1970s. And so we're going to examine this process, this difficult process of decolonization. Part of this is going to be the formation of these newly independent states in a world that is surrounded by the Cold War as well. And so there's quite a bit of complexity that exists in this process. Some states will be able to negotiate their independence. Others will have to fight through a series of armed struggles. But regardless, the process of independence is going to lead to a number of long-range consequences that are still with us here in the 21st century. So in your document, you're going to answer three different questions. The first of which deals with why Western powers in the end decide to grant their colonies independence after refusing to do so after the First World War. So part of negotiating independence means that these Western states have to release these colonies to become independent states. And so there are a number of different causes. The first of which deals with the vast cost of empire. And in many cases, it was way too costly to hold on to these colonies than to actually release them. And so you even have countries like Portugal, which is going to hold on to its African colonies, even as it's dealing with massive financial crisis, because there was the motivation to keep them so that you remain a world or global power. But for some states, they did not have that choice. And Britain had to see the writing on the wall after the Second World War, as they had a massive debt stemming not just from the First World War and the Great Depression, but especially the Second World War as well. That many of these colonies, especially as rebellions and uprisings taking place, would just simply be way too costly to be able to manage. And so therefore, with the cost of empire, the notion of releasing these colonies became much, much more attractive to these governments. Secondly, it was the nature of the Second World War itself and trying to learn from the process of what happened in the first. In 1940, President Franklin Roosevelt and Prime Minister Winston Churchill came together before the United States entered the war with the anticipation that eventually at some point the United States would enter the war as well, created what is known as the Atlantic Charter, whereby this war, unlike the first, there will be guarantees by the Allies of one, that there will be no territorial gains. Secondly, that there will be no changes to territory. So you're not going to see the type of Middle Eastern mandate system that was created after the First World War. And not only that, those promises by Woodrow Wilson in the First World War regarding self-determination of states would actually occur. So the right of all people to choose the form of government that they decide to live under. And so self-determination and the Atlantic Charter would actually come to be. And lastly, the Soviet Union in the Cold War will start to call out the Western world. So believing that they're the bastion of true democracy, the Soviet Union is going to say, look, you say democracy, but there is enslavement of people all across the globe because of the possession, the existence of these colonies. And so the Soviet Union will use Western colonialism as a means of propaganda, which the Western world feels as if it needs to respond. They're eventually even going to call out the Jim Crow system of segregation in the American South and say, like, look, you say democracy, but the reality is you are commanding people in a way that does not demonstrate Western liberal ideals. And maybe the Soviet model might be the way to go. And so the Soviet Union, in denouncing colonialism as just another means of capitalist exploitation, and so therefore the United States and the Western world felt the need to act on this. And so they're going to start to release many of their colonies to become independent states. But it's not all easy. And if you could imagine a situation where, look, if you are a teenager and you've had conflict with parents, and all of a sudden you seek the process of emancipation, hey, what would happen if you were a teenager and you're able to have your own freedoms? Yes, you have those freedoms. No more curfews, no more having to clean your rooms and so forth here. But imagine the type of actual struggle, hey, that would exist financially, hey, economically, where would you stay, and so forth. So hey, even the best notions of freedom are often challenged by the realities of the world, which much of the third world countries would have to face. So the second question is this: identify and explain one way that colonies were able to secure independence, and we're going to highlight two specific manners. The first of which deals with India and the negotiated independence that India went through. Again, this is not without struggle. This is not without people being killed or hurt. And we saw this through the work of Gandhi in the creation of India and eventually also Pakistan as well. And so as us in the class, we're going to go ahead and take a look at this further in a number of other documents. And also we've seen it in the movie that we watched as well. And so if you're viewing this from elsewhere, these are good case studies to take a look at, but we're not going to deal with it here in this lecture. What we will take a look at is several cases in sub-Saharan Africa, starting with West Africa. So before we actually examine the independence movement in West Africa, it is important to note the type of suppression, and particularly if we go back to the 19th century imperialism and the notions of white paternalism and the white rescuer from Europe that would bring civilization to the uncivilized world. You have all type of suppressive policies for Black Africans and other ethnic groups across the world. And so it's important, if you're going to try to raise the type of leadership that is necessary for an independent movement, for individuals in those states to not only believe that they can govern themselves, but have the capacity and the ability to be able to do so as well. And so what was really influential was what is known as the Negritude movement, which was influenced in a number of places, whether it's the Harlem Renaissance in the United States, but also a litany of other authors and artists that were in many of the French colonies in the 1930s and 1940s. And they formulated what is known as the Negritude movement, protesting against French colonial rule and also the policy of assimilating into Western cultures as well. So we have people like Leopold Senghor, who would become the first president of the Republic of Senegal in 1960, amongst others, who will start to examine Western values critically and to reassess themselves as Africans. I love this quote by Claude McKay, who basically says this. He says, "Do not be deceived. For every deed you do, I can outmatch. Am I not Africa's son? Black of that black land where black deeds are done." And so notion of a leadership that stems from places like West Africa. And so groups like this are going to push for autonomy. And so even as colonies, they're going to fight for the creation of domestic assemblies that will form in the 30s, 1940s, and 1950s as well, pressuring, again, using those liberal ideas to say, look, we want some form of autonomy. And so the Gold Coast Assembly in West Africa in 1957 would vote for independence, and Britain will allow for it through a series of negotiations in 1957 to create what is eventually known as the country of Ghana as well, under the leadership of Kwame Nkrumah. But what Nkrumah and others were really wary of was Western, quote, neo-colonialism. So in other words, again, we talk about independence, economic independence of individuals, and in this case, as a new state, they live in a world where Western dominance, and particularly one that is governed by Western corporations. And what they're going to formulate is this control, this form of neo-colonialism. And that in the end, you have these colonies that are export states. They have plantations, mines, and so forth, where they exist in the Western economic system. And so Kwame Nkrumah was concerned that Western capitalist institutions will continue to govern these new states. And so he formed what he called a local form of Marxist socialism, a collection of collectivization of agriculture where it need be, and also state-run industries as well. And oftentimes it involves the nationalization of these Western corporations. But economic problems, challenges from others in his own state will eventually lead Nkrumah to seize power and create a one-party state. And so we're going to see a trend that exists. And all these problems that we're going to discuss further, it's going to lead to one-party rule and oftentimes dictatorships as well. Nkrumah himself was overthrown in 1966. But again, his is an example of negotiated independence with the British authorities. Okay. But as hinted, this process of independence will also be compromised by the Cold War itself. And so previously we looked at the Truman Doctrine, the notion that the United States will intervene in places where there is a threat that communism will be applied to these newly independent states. And so as these countries become independent, this becomes a major issue, especially when they start to take on socialist-style policies like Nkrumah did in the Gold Coast. So therefore, there are states whereby the process of independence will be much more complex, that the process and the negotiation for independence will take too long, and it may lead in the end to armed struggles. So the case studies we're going to look at is particularly in regards to British Kenya and then a number of French colonies as well, Algeria and Vietnam. Starting with Kenya, which just like we see on the Gold Coast, during the Second World War, there was the push for representative bodies, again, local autonomy by Black Africans, and that they would have local elections for representatives. But many thought it was not enough, and independence could not come soon enough. And so what rose in Kenya was this movement led by this group called the Mau Maus, an association that was formed from the Kikuyu people in Kenya. And the Mau Mau advocated violent resistance, and their collective leadership actually got people to create ritual oaths that basically say, hey, we're going to promote an independent and unified independent movement amongst the various tribes in British Kenya. And so in 1950, the Mau Mau movement itself was banned by British authorities. And in 1952, after a Mau Mau campaign of sabotage and assassinations, the British Kenyan government created a state of emergency and began for 4 years to act with violence against the Kikuyu rebels. In the end, by 1956, about 11,000 rebels had been killed in the fighting, along with over 100 Europeans and 2,000 African loyalists as well. So it was almost like an independent civil war, a revolutionary war for the Kenyans. More than 20,000 Kikuyu people were put into detention camps where the British tried to create this re-education system to try to get them to disavow Kenyan nationalism. So we're going to see this in other parts of the globe as well. But out of this comes a leader. After the defeat of the Kikuyus, there's international pressure by many across the globe who are going to say, look, this is repressive. This is not type of democratic values that Britain holds. And so one leader, Jomo Kenyatta, who had been jailed as a Mau Mau leader in 1953, eventually became the first prime minister of an independent Kenya. So after the fighting, after the uprising and the suppression, there is negotiation, and the new state of Kenya is formed. However, just like we see elsewhere in West Africa, the issues stemming from independence is going to create a struggle whereby Jomo Kenyatta is going to create a one-party capitalist state. And we'll see about some of these issues later on in this lecture. The two other parts we're going to examine will be French Algeria and Vietnam. And in these places, the French, especially after its embarrassment in the Second World War and its struggle to try to reclaim a role as a global power, it meant that after the Second World War, the French are going to act in order to reclaim its colonies, as sort of an avenue to say, look, we're France, we're still France, and we're still a global power. And so they're going to do everything in its might to try to reclaim one, Algeria, which is seen by the French as a part of France, and then Vietnam as well, both of which were occupied by the Axis powers. And so very immediately after the Second World War, French military forces and colonial authorities are going to return with dire consequences. But we're going to examine this in another class lesson, and you're going to evaluate both the independence movements in Algeria and Vietnam. So our last question deals with the negative long-term consequences for these newly independent states and why there is not just a struggle, but many of these democracies will fail in these newly independent countries. So some consequences, the first of which deals with the Cold War. So you can't forget that the second half of the 20th century is defined by the ideological conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. And we see actual military intervention in Korea and also, as mentioned before, in Vietnam as well. Both of which the United States is going to actively send its own men, resources, supplies to fight in these conflicts, some more successful than others. But again, we'll evaluate this in class in a subsequent lesson. The Soviet Union will go through a similar process in trying to support a pro-socialist government in Afghanistan, and it's going to fight a nearly decade-long war that will have dire consequences for the Soviet Union in the 1980s. But in both cases, again, there is an armed struggle because of the fear and the support of various socialist, communist-style governments and the response by the other side in dealing with these particular states. Sometimes it's not a direct military conflict, but oftentimes it's done in a much more discreet manner, particularly by the American CIA in its actions in the Congo, in the ouster of Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba, and the ouster of the Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh as well. In other places like Guatemala and other parts in South America as well, American discrete forces, and also you can argue that the Soviet KGB will act on behalf of their nation states in a discreet manner, using spies, using assassinations, using money and resources to try to influence the governments in these newly independent states. There's also the issue in regards to the boundaries and the borders that were created by whether it's the scramble for Africa, by colonialization, the Middle Eastern mandates, and so forth. And so frequently we see separatist movements and vast migration of peoples because of these questionable boundaries that were formed by Western imperialism. A great example of this is in the new state of Nigeria. Again, before the 20th century, there was no notion of Nigeria. There was the Muslim-dominated North, the Christian South, and you've got dozens of different ethnic groups, languages that are spoken, tribal groups that have never seen each other in a nationalist movement. So all of a sudden, when Nigeria becomes an independent state in 1950s and 60s, there are a number of groups who did not want to be a part of this. A good example of this is the province of Biafra, the oil-rich region in the southern part, and they, in the end, tried to declare independence from the rest of Nigeria, and a civil war is fought, and where the Biafrans themselves were crushed by the new Nigerian state, with all sorts of suffering, particularly for the civilians who had to go through this conflict. We've examined previously the independence of India and the separation of Pakistan by Muhammad Ali Jinnah. And then we've also seen in the Middle East, whereby new countries like Syria, Jordan, Iraq were formed by the British and French. And we have the interesting case of King Faisal, who was one of the first monarchs of Syria, was pushed out and placed on the throne of Iraq afterwards. But again, all these states, these borders are artificially drawn by the British and French. And so we've got Sunnis and Shiites, we've got Arabs and Kurds, all of these different groups that will now have to either create some sort of coalition government for it to function or go through a form of civil war. So these Middle Eastern mandates are going to will continue to trouble the Middle East throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. Not only that, but you have a number of individuals, particularly the middle class, those who have previously worked in the colonial governments, who may have the opportunity to move to their former metropoles. And so you can imagine if you have some wealth, you've had some status, and for yourself and for your family, you want safety, you want economic prosperity. You may not find that in your home country. And so we see a massive movement of people, particularly educated individuals or people who've worked in the civil service before, who are moving to the metropoles, going to London, going to Paris, going to Los Angeles, wherever it might be, to find for themselves better opportunity for themselves and their families. And so if you're listening to this, you may find that you and your family, whether it's your parents or your grandparents, who had moved to the United States or Britain or France because they're looking for a better opportunity than what their home countries may have brought them. And so, therefore, one of the biggest challenges of independence is the brain drain. That it's hard to create a democratic government without the middle class, who many of which have left. And are seeking new opportunities. So how do you form a independent government whereby people may not have any experience or education to be able to run these states? And so they're going to really try to do it without the type of individuals and experience that is necessary. And you're going to see all sorts of corruption, all sorts of ineffective policies or execution by the new bureaucracies to actually run these particular states. We've talked about the unintended boundaries. This here is a map of what the Middle East might look like if you took into account ethnic or religious groups. And not only that, we mentioned neocolonialism. Many of these states are going to try to form and have ambitious programs to try to modernize. And in the exact same situation like we see elsewhere, they're going to get loans from Western banks. And when they default on those loans, they can't pay them. These Western organizations will come in and say, look, this is what you're going to have to do. These are our tax rates. These are the benefits you're going to have to give Western corporations. And this is what many observers at the time called neocolonialism, that despite being independent, they're still governed by these Western financial authorities. And then to add to this, there are a number of different internal disputes, whether it deals with ethnic or religious violence. We see that in dramatic cases like the Rwandan genocide, the apartheid policies of the white South African governments over the black majorities, a number of ethnic and racial disputes that oftentimes may lead to civil war. The regional conflicts, for example, Biafra in Nigeria, the type of religious conflicts between the Hindus and the Muslims in South Asia, between the Christians and the Muslims in various West African states. All of these issues, unfortunately, may in the end result in military coups. That military strongmen, seeing all the issues in their countries, or for them being ambitious individuals deciding, hey, look, maybe I am the solution to these problems. They use the monopoly on force to be able to seize the government, oftentimes promising independent elections to come, which in some ways, some cases, never come at all. Or elections happen, all of a sudden, General so-and-so wins with a 99% vote, and they become now these presidents for life, and oftentimes may result in other subsequent military coups. And you can imagine this cycle of military coup, bad elections, ineffective bureaucracy, exploitation by Western institutions, leads to now issues in developing truly independent states that are thriving. And we still see that here in the 21st century. To add one more thread to this, many of these states are going to join together in a number of international movements as well. For instance, the International Communist Movement, Comintern. There are also leaders who try to come together to try to create unity amongst African states, separate from what we see in the West, and for these states to be able to join together. And so frequently we have cases like in the Congo, when there are issues in the independence movements there, it's actually African troops that will come and become the peacemakers and the peacekeepers in other African states. So there is movement amongst Africa to create a pan-African sense of unity and cooperation. Then there are also the non-aligned states of the world here. So whereas you've got the first world, the United States and their allies, capitalist, democratic, you've got the authoritarian communist states with their model of how to run their states in the world. And finally, you've got these newly independent states who are saying, look, we don't want to be part of this. And so you've got here people like states like India, Kenya, Egypt, Indonesia coming together to form an institution that say, look, we don't want a part of the drama that exists in the first two worlds. And then finally, we've got other movements like Pan-Arabism, and particularly led by new states like Egypt as well. So in subsequent lessons, we're going to go and take a look at the non-aligned movement and also Pan-Arabism, particularly in Egypt. But either way, you have now the struggles of independence here in the 20th century and the legacy that continues to exist in the 21st century as well.